Certainly, I wouldn't go so far to say that it's the only theme of Jesus' preaching, but we do hear often enough Jesus using these or words to similar effect about those who humble themselves will be exalted and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Or elsewhere he might say, the last will become first, the first will become last. Regardless of how he phrases it, Jesus puts a premium on a life of service as being constitutive to the gospel, of being really an expectation of those who would follow him. Certainly in instructing his apostles, his disciples, he repeats this over and over again. He also does it to chastise those who fashion themselves as rather righteous, the religious leaders or people who kind of present themselves as somehow over and above the crowd, Pharisees over tax collectors, those who see themselves as being somewhat advanced on their spiritual journeys. And those words resonate with us today, or they should anyway, for us who are trying to live out the gospel in our lives. The temptation, of course, is that perennial one where we might want to develop that relationship with Jesus in a very personal way, which is good, necessary, indeed it is laudable. I'd say, absolutely, positively constitutive as our identity as Christians, as sons and daughters of God. But all too often, we can kind of get to a point of divorcing that from our call of how we relate to those around us. We need to be careful about spiritual pride. We have to be careful about separating ourselves. There's a story, and it may very well be a made-up story, but it could very well be true, of the person who sits down, the woman who sits down in her seat in a plane, only to find that the person assigned the seat next to her looks rather ragged, somewhat unkempt, maybe not even perfectly attentive to their hygiene. So the poor man is sitting next to this rather well-to-do woman. And the woman calls the flight attendant over and says, could we do something about our seating? I can't imagine staying on this long flight next to this person. I'm just very, very uncomfortable. The flight attendant comes back to the pilot and says, we have a problem, and explains the situation. And the pilot is, a little bit disturbed, and he says, here's what we can do. She goes back to the seat and says, we can make the accommodation. We don't want anyone to be uncomfortable or sitting next to someone who is so repugnant to them. So the pilot says that we do have a seat up in first class. Well, the woman starts to get up, and flight attendant looks to the man and says, sir, come with me. We've got a seat for you in first class. Who knows if it's true or not? It very well could be, though, in terms of attitudes that we have, where we put ourselves out and against or over and against those who may not measure up to our standards, may not meet the expectations that we have. Yet how many times does Pope Francis say over and over and over again, and we probably struggle with it a little bit, about we need to be able to encounter people where they are, not just as we would want them to be, as we'd have them to be, as we would expect them to be. Rather than heaping expectations on, as the Pharisees often did, we need to be able to model service, encounter, acceptance of people where they are, as they are. It may not be where we'd want them to be. It may not even be where God would want them to be. But it's where we meet them. When we create that distance, if we are called to be apostles, to be disciples, to be images of Christ, are we creating a distance between Christ and them as we create a distance between themselves and ourselves? Over and over again, Jesus tells us that there's a place at the table for everyone. We somehow just have to make room. Make room in our hearts. Make room in our minds. Make room in our lives for those situations that may be a little less than convenient, those situations that may cause us a little discomfort. Because when we allow ourselves to maybe be a wee bit uncomfortable, could those not be the avenues that Jesus places in our lives to open our doors, to maybe help us to become a little bit better, and in turn, helping others to get maybe a little bit closer to him? You know, in a moment, we'll do a blessing of couples who are married. Isn't that the heart of any solid marriage? Of being able to not put oneself at the center, making oneself first all the time. But marriage by its very nature, is it not about sacrifice, mutual service, looking out for the other? Be that the other being one's wife, husband, son, daughter, grandchild. It's always about putting us in a situation of being with the other where they are, even in that moment when we may wish that they weren't where they are right now, and together walking with them. So, my friends, there's our challenge for the day. If we allow ourselves to be open, one thing I could probably guarantee you today is if you look for the opportunity, if you pray for the opportunity, God will give you a chance to be a little bit uncomforted today. God will put somebody there where you might have an initial impulse to cross the street, take a turn, walk in a different direction. If you find yourself in that position today, listen to the Spirit. Maybe God's saying, instead of turning away, turn toward and see what God might be able to do. Amen?